Well, if you would, please turn your Bible to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And we are continuing on through this chapter. And what we have seen throughout this chapter is Paul is not only vindicating his apostleship, if you will, but also what Paul is doing is writing down to the Corinthians and basically encouraging them and letting them know that the pastors of each local fellowship are to be taken care of. And we saw that even last week as we continued on. Look at verse 7 of what we looked at last week when Paul wrote, "Who goeth a warfare any time at his own charges? Who planteth the vineyard and eateth not of the fruit thereof? Or who feedeth a flock and eateth not of the milk of the flock?" Verse 8, "Say I these things as a man? Or saith not the law the same also?" Verse 9, "For it is written in the law of Moses, Thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doth God take care for oxen?" And so we're continuing on from that passage, and really just from the beginning of chapter 9. And essentially what we saw last week were two main aspects in that phrase, verse 9, of "Doth God take care of the oxen?" What we see there is God cares for the animals. And how much more does He care for those of us who are created in His image? And by that I, of course, mean all of us as human beings. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, we read that in the image of God He created them. One of the things I mentioned on our last Wednesday night Bible study was the fact that we are the only parts of creation that we are told that we are created in the image of God. The animals are not. The plants are not. The earth is not. We, as humans, are created in the image of God. And so we're going to pick all of this up as we look in verses 11 through 14 this morning. And actually, I forgot verse 10, because we covered verse 10 last week. Look at verse 10 with me. "Or saith he it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt. This is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, and he that thresheth in hope should be partaker of his hope." And basically what Paul is writing there, continuing on to the fact of, yes, God takes care of His animals. He loves animals. How much more does He care about us, those created in His image? Paul then goes on to say, the one who participates in the work should also be the partaker of the fruit of his labor. And so that's what we're going to just continue on with that theme throughout 1 Corinthians chapter 9. What we're going to look at this morning, our 3 points, are reap what you sow, hinder not the gospel, and finally the reward for labor. So point number 1, we look at reap what you sow in verse 11. Paul there, continuing on, says, "If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things?" So Paul here starts off by saying, "if we." Now, we covered this a couple of weeks ago when we were looking at verse 4. If you look at verse 4, it says, "Have we not power to eat and drink?" And we looked at who the we was. Now, those of you who weren't here, or you might have forgotten because that was a few weeks ago, if you're like me, sometimes you forget what you did yesterday or forget what you're going to be doing today. And so Paul here in verse 4 says we. Now, who were the we? If you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 12, chapter 3, verses 21 and 22, we are given that answer, and that is Paul himself along with Apollos and Cephas. If you remember, Cephas is another name for Peter. So Paul here says, if we, speaking of himself, speaking of Apollos, and speaking of Cephas, so Paul here is bringing them in. He says, if we sown unto you. Now, the word sown is an agricultural term. You could pretty easily surmise that. And in the Greek, it just literally means to scatter seed. Because what they used to do at that time, I don't know if farmers do it today. I'm looking at a couple of our ranchers, but for confirmation. But what they would do is they would walk around and they would just scatter the seed. They would just grab it from the bag and just throw it out. You guys remember the parable of the sower that Jesus told? That's the picture there. When he was saying that some of the seed would fall on the path. As a little kid, I used to go, why would they put the seed on the path? Right? But when you learn that, back and then especially, they would just scatter the seed. They would just throw it out. What would happen? It would, obviously, some of it could go onto the path. Some of it would go into the rocky ground. And so that's the picture there. If they have, Paul says, if we have sown, then he says spiritual things. The word for spiritual things is pneuma. Well, I'm going to blow it, so let me start over. Pneumatikos. Pneumatikos. And it comes from the word pneuma. Pneuma is the word we get for breath or spirit, for like Holy Spirit, the pneuma, if you will. From pneuma, we get like pneumatic. Is that what you just said? Okay, I thought I read your lips. Pneumatic. What are pneumatic tools? They work off of air, right? And that's the idea, is pneuma. And so pneumatikos literally means the things that are concerning the Spirit, the things that are concerning God. We saw actually this same word in chapter 2, verse 13, chapter 2, verse 15, as well as in chapter 3, verse 1. And each of the times it's translated as spiritual. So Paul is bringing this word back, and so he says there, if we have sown spiritual things, if we have, in a way, scattered the seed of the spiritual things, if we are doing the work, we're ministering, we're preaching, we're teaching, we're going through the whole process, then what does he say? Is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? Now, the word for carnal, let me just say this. Oftentimes, the word carnal kind of has a negative connotation in the church because people say, don't live like the carnal man. And Paul does deal with the carnal mind and the carnal man. But carnal here is really, it's the Greek word sarkikos, come from sarx. Sarx, S-A-R-X, in the Greek is any word dealing with the flesh. In fact, a little side note, from sarx we get the word sarcasm. Now you might be going, okay, how does flesh and sarcasm work? I know how some of your minds are thinking, because that's what my mind was doing. Sarcasm, if you translate it literally, means to take off the flesh. Yeah. So it's just, think about it. I mean, sarcasm can be something that kind of strips you. Cutting, exactly.
Acid mouth.
Yeah. So that's the word, but sarkikos, of course, Paul is using it here of carnal things. Now let's back up a little bit when he says, is it a great thing? The word there is mega. Mega. Like the prefix, that we use for mega all the time. It means something huge, large. He goes, is it a huge, large thing that we shall reap? So Paul here is speaking again about the agriculture process, right, of sowing and reaping. The word for reap means what you guys all think it means, right? Yeah. Right? Well, it's the Greek word therizo. Therizo. That comes from theros. Theros means summer or harvest time. Thus, it literally means to do the work of summer. Listen to this. The word reap is actually a very expressive word in the Greek. Because it means to do the work in the summertime so that you can reap and gather in the harvest. Now, those of you who have maybe even your own gardens, those of you who do that type of work, you know that if you don't maintain, right, you're not going to get any fruit. You're not going to be able to reap the benefits of that. And that's the whole idea of the word. It's a very industrious type of word. We just sometimes think of reap, but we just think of the crop that appears. You know, with the kids going to Honey, Nisha and I drive so often to Honey, we could probably drive the road blindfolded. Don't worry, we don't. But we go past a lot of farms out there. And on the road leading right up to Honey School, we'll see this big old field. And you know, it's amazing now that we've been going there for a few years. You see the whole process, but you know what? I never see anyone working. But I definitely see the fruits of their labor. Because one time I drive by, and now the whole ground has been furrowed. And then another time I drive by, and I see that they're watering, so I know that they've already planted. For whatever reason, my timing is never there when those people are out there working. But guess what? I see the results of their hard labor. And then there's time when their crop is taller than me. We just drive right by, and it's taller than me. And listen, they don't grow that crop that large by sitting on their butt doing... Am I allowed to say butt? We don't have any little kids here, so I think I can get away with it. But we're not... Listen, that farmer doesn't get his crop because he sat around in his lazy boy watching the NCAA tournament. Right? What was he out there doing? He was working. And that's the whole word of reap is literally, you're having to do the whole process. So, to bring it all together, Paul here is bringing about the principle of sowing and reaping. And he's speaking to a group of people and says, hey, the one who sows should also reap. If you're putting in the hard work, you will get the fruits of your labor. Now, I'm going to go on a little tangent, but I'm not going to go too far. I think that's one of the biggest problems with a lot of people in our society today. They see what their parents have. They don't realize how hard their parents have worked. So they want what their parents have without making the work. They say, hey, I want that. You know, I want to have 4 weeks of vacation. I want to have the newest and fanciest car. I want to go on all these vacations, right? And instead, what do they need to do? They need to start working and working hard. That's one of the problems of our nation is too many people are expecting that free handout. They're expecting to have the fruits without the labor. And Paul is bringing that into here and saying, hey, we, meaning me, Apollos, and Cephas, we have labored, we have worked amongst you guys in Corinth. We have poured, we sweated, we've labored. And he says, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? What is he saying there? He's saying, if we have been laboring amongst you, then we should reap your carnal things, meaning to receive that payment for his hard work. He said, this should just be a normal aspect of any fellowship, really, in any church. Turn your Bibles to Galatians chapter 6. Page 1247 if you have the Schofield. And I forgot to look it up in our new Pew Bible, so I apologize. Galatians, and it's going to be to the right. So you go through 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and then you'll come to Galatians. Oh.
Chapter. Didn't think we had surface here.
Galatians chapter 6. Marsha's got a hip too.
Oh, sorry.
Galatians chapter 6. Paul, in Galatians chapter 6, beginning in verse 7, and I would encourage you guys to kind of read this whole passage so you can kind of get the whole idea. But here, what does he say? Beginning in verse 7, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." Look at verse 8. "For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. But he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap everlasting life." Or life everlasting, sorry. Now, what is Paul saying here? He's writing to the churches in Galatia, and he's not saying necessarily to them, hey, you're going to go to hell if you do something bad. Okay? But what he does say is you will reap the consequences of your sin. Right? And that's what he's saying here. If you sow to the flesh, now in this aspect, that word flesh most likely is sarx. I forgot to look it up in the Greek. And what he's saying there is if you're doing something that you desire in your flesh, that is not correct. That is not in line with God's will for your life. What's going to happen? You will of the flesh reap corruption. And then he goes on to say, "But he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting." It's kind of the whole adage about how when just in our own lives, we might just say, man, I would like to just sit around all day and do nothing every day and just do whatever I feel like. But what are you going to reap? If you do nothing, what do you reap? Nothing. Right? If you do nothing, you're going to reap nothing. If you sow sin, what are you going to reap? The consequences of sin. And so Paul talks about sowing and reaping as well in Galatians 6. But of course, he's talking about how they live their lives as believers. Here, back in our text, you can turn back to 1 Corinthians. He is saying, hey, we, Paulos, Cephas, myself, if we're sowing we're sowing in the spiritual things. We're ministering to you. We're blessing you guys. And I'm going to say it again just so that no one can ever accuse me of cherry picking this passage. Okay, this is not about me. This is not about me. The church gives me money once a month to help cover expenses. This is not me trying to say, hey, I need a raise. This is just where we're at. Because where were we at before chapter 9? Chapter 8, right? If I was all about me, I would have just parachuted right to chapter 9 immediately. I said, okay, that's our study in 1 Corinthians. Now let's pass out the offering plate. We're not going to leave until that offering plate is overflowing. No, that's not my heart either. The whole idea is, it is set up that the church supports its pastor so that he could spend that time laboring in the Word. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Continuing on, point number 2, verse 12. Hinder not the gospel. Hinder not the gospel. Let's see what he writes in verse 12. If others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. So Paul writes, and he says, if others be partakers of this power over you. The word partakers literally just means what you would think it means: to share, to have an association with, to be in a partnership, right? To come alongside. And in the word power, we've had this word power multiple times already. It's exousia in the Greek. It's a word that means power and authority. If you remember, we talked about it in chapter 8, verse 9. In chapter 8, verse 9, it's actually translated as liberty. And essentially that word exousia for power means you have the authority, but it doesn't always mean you're going to go and use that power for your benefit. You do have authority. You can use that power. And you will use it when it's needed. So when Paul here says, if others be partakers of this power over you, what is he saying there? He says, if others, he goes, if you have another pastor that comes in and starts overseeing the church fellowship, he says, let me get back here. If others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? What does he say there? He again is referring to himself and Cephas, and he's saying, we also once were in this position, but if you have another one coming in, what does he say? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things. So Paul is continuing on from verse 11 saying, if others be partakers of this power over you, you're to do the same for them. You're to reward that pastor for his hard work. And then he says, nevertheless, we have not used this power. He goes on to say, nevertheless. Now, same word, power, exousia. And that word not, we mentioned it many, many times before. In the Greek, it's ou. And it's the word that means full and complete negation. So Paul is saying, we did not cross this line. We did not cross this line. We did not use this power, but what did he say? But suffer all things, lest we should hinder. Suffer there literally means to bear or to endure. In fact, other time we see the same Greek word stego for suffer is found in 1 Corinthians 13:7. Now, all of you should have instantly thought of, what is 1 Corinthians 13? What do we all call it? The love chapter, right? All right. 1 Corinthians 13:7 says this about charity. Beareth all things. There's that same word. There's that beareth. It means to endure, to go through. Oftentimes, chapter 13 is read at weddings or, for couples, and that's the whole idea is, hey, let's remind our young couples. Marriage is hard. Marriage is difficult. If you don't bear all things, your marriage is going to be over quick. And that's not the context, but you guys know what I'm saying. And then he says there, suffer all things, lest we should hinder. Lest we should hinder. Now, the word hinder is an interesting word in the Greek. It's enkope, and it carries the idea of digging a trench to keep an enemy from coming. I started to think of like a moat. But maybe not always a moat, but just something that would be a hindrance to those who are trying to attack. Some sort of trench. It could even be a little one, enough to trip up the horses or trip up the men, cause them to break legs, what have you. It's that idea there of producing something to protect you. By the way, this is the only time in all of the Greek scriptures that this Greek noun is used. In fact, we're going to see a few others just like this. So, Paul there says, we should hinder. We don't want to be that trap. We don't want to be that ditch that would cause you to keep from coming, is what he's saying here. What does he say? Hinder what? We don't want to hinder the gospel of Christ. The gospel of Christ. The word gospel, of course, means good news, and if you break it apart in the Greek, it's euangelion. The U part of the euangelion is EU, and as a prefix, it makes anything good. Any word that follows, like eulogy. You guys ever been to a funeral and someone gives a eulogy and all they do is make fun of, or not make fun of, let me rephrase that. Say bad things about the person in the who's in the casket? They're not doing a good eulogy, because the word eulogy means good words. When you go to a funeral, you want a eulogy. You want to, and as a pastor, when I oversee or officiate a funeral, I want to say good words about that person. That person might be the worst person in the world, but I'm going to try to find something good because I want to encourage the family. If you've lost someone, you know what I'm talking about. Evangelion, the last part, angelion, comes from the Greek angelos, which we get our word angel or messenger from. So it's good news. It's a good message, if you will. Paul here is writing that it is sometimes expedient for the minister, basically, to not receive a salary. Why? Because it would hinder the gospel. It would hinder the church being able to meet its own needs. It would also could be a situation where if the fellowship was very new in the faith, they might not understand. And so Paul says, hey, it's okay. There are times not to demand a salary or even to receive a minimal amount. Why? So that you don't hinder the gospel of Christ. Now, I will say this, for many people who call themselves pastors, they don't have this type of heart. There are many pastors I know personally who have used every aspect of being in full-time ministry and any position in a large church in order to ascend because they want to get better. They act like it's the corporate ladder in the business world. And that should never, ever be done. You don't go into the ministry to become rich. You don't go into the ministry to become famous. And I would argue and say that most pastors, and I know I might be stepping on toes this morning, most pastors who are famous, I would say don't listen to them. Because of the world that we live in, most churches have heaped up for themselves, as Paul said, those who will scratch their itching ears. And if you want to be popular, if you want to be famous, then guess what? You're going to be watering down the Word of God. And Paul here says, listen, it's better if sometimes that minister who comes in, and he even uses himself as an example, we don't charge because we don't want to hinder the gospel of Christ. We don't want to hinder the gospel of Christ. We would much rather go out and keep our day job so that we can continue to minister to people. Now, as the church continues to grow, every minister does have a right then to start saying, hey, I should start getting some payment here. And really, the church should just step up and start doing that. The Young's literal translation, I like how Robert Young translated this verses 11 and 12. He says this, if we to you the spiritual things did so, great is it if we, your fleshly things, do reap. If others do partake of the authority over you, not we more? But we did not use this authority, but all things we bear, that we may give no hindrance to the good news of the Christ. Now, that's terrible English, but the one thing that I like looking at Young's literal translation is he does just that. He takes it straight from the Greek and translates it literal. It's not good English, but you get a good sense of what is being said. Point number 3 as we finish here. Reward for labor, verses 13 and 14. Reward for labor. He says there in verse 13, do ye not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar. So Paul says here, do ye not know? Now the word know, not, there is again the same word ou, that full, direct, complete negation. And then the word know, we've seen the word know multiple times already in 1 Corinthians alone. The word know in the Greek is eido. Eido. E-I-D-O. By the way, because I like this type of stuff, I went and searched it. Ido is found 30 times in 28 verses in 1 Corinthians. Now, if you look at the rest of the Greek scriptures, Ido is predominantly translated as to see. But in 1 Corinthians, 25 of the 30 times that it is found in 1 Corinthians, it is translated as to know. And it's the whole idea of seeing and understanding for yourself, to have that fullness of knowledge, to have that mental concentration or focus. And that's kind of the picture there that Paul is doing. He's saying, do ye not know? Do you not see? Are you not aware of? I want you guys to be able to be aware of, is what Paul is saying, that they which minister about. Here's an important word. Just right in line with what we've been studying this week and the previous 2 weeks. The word for minister there, or really it's which minister about, is ergozomi. Ergozomi. The root word is ergon, and ergon is where we get the word work or labor from. And it means just that. It means that toiling. It means that hard work. It means, going out and hoeing the field and watering and sowing. It means getting up every single day to labor. In fact, this is the same word, ergozomai, that we saw in verse 6, where Paul says, or I only and Barnabas, have we not power to forbear working? Same word. That labor. By the way, the word minister has kind of taken a new connotation, especially in America. Anytime you say the word minister, most people will think of what? A pastor, right? Someone who ministers, right? You go to like England and a lot of other countries, and sometimes they still have that connection of what the word minister means. Listen to what the Oxford English Dictionary defines minister as. I think I have it on your handout. Do I have it? Might be at the very bottom of your page, if I remember correctly. Okay, Barsha gave me the confirmation. All right, a person under the authority of another, one who carries out executive duties as the agent or representative of a superior. In Britain, they call them MKs, MPs.
Minister of Parliament.
Exactly.
And then
what
you
is
have the Prime Minister.
right? Exactly. Thank you. And it's the same in Israel. Those are the MKs, ministers of the Knesset, and then they have the Prime Minister as well. And what is that idea there? Is to remind them that they are to be civil servants, that their boss is those who elected them. Right? Just like here in America. Don't get me going on the political climate today here. Yeah, I think I'm going to skip that one this time. Just better not. Also, though, you see that definition? That is an excellent definition of what a minister in the church or a pastor ought to be known as, one who works hard. Now, does that mean that a minister or pastor, he should be the one who's the hardest working, building the church or, fixing things? Well, if he's someone that does not have that ability, no, you don't want him to do that. You will destroy the church. But the whole idea of a pastor is one who labors in the word. Here's my little riff on big churches this time. Too often, and like I said, most of you guys know, I've been a part of large churches, so I've seen this firsthand. Most of the time, the ministers on staff are so busy doing administrative things and doing, whether it's making sure things are happening, make sure the newest event is going on, that they have no time to study in the Word. And that is one of my largest complaints and criticisms of a large church. Guys, I've lived it. My wife has lived it with me. Where there used to be a Sunday morning, I would go in at 3 in the morning to the office at the church to study for that Sunday's message. And sometimes I had two different teachings that Sunday. And I would prepare those Sunday morning because the whole rest of the work week I was doing just that. Everything but studying. Listen, as a church, you know what you guys should require the most out of me? Is that I labor in the Word. And that's what every church should do. And when the time comes and I die and you guys need a new pastor, that's who you want. You want to hire someone who labors in the Word, who studies the Word. You don't want someone who rolls up on a Sunday morning, is not prepared, and then just goes, hey, you know what, I think we're going to go do this, and then just talks off the top of his head the whole time. And made no study. You want someone who labors in the Word. Now, I'm giving you guys insight into what you need to expect of me. Most pastors will not ever say this to their congregation because they want to be able to get off easy. They want it to be easy. Now, listen, guys, there's been scandals in the church where pastors have been accused of taking someone else's sermon and just copying the notes and then doing that. That's not laboring in the Word. That's not working. You copy and paste and listen. You don't want that pastor. You don't want him. Paul would mention throughout the scriptures how hard he worked not to be a burden to the various assemblies that he ministered to. We saw that in chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, and I gave you guys other passages in the handout as well. Paul makes it very specific, yeah? In verse 4, verse 6, Paul says, we as apostles, Barnabas and I, we don't have to work. We can make you guys pay us. But what did Paul still do? He worked hard outside of that ministry and then worked hard as their pastor. You know what? Let's do this. Turn your Bibles to chapter 3. Chapter 3, we covered this before, but I want to show you guys again because I want you to hold me accountable. I want you to hold any other pastor, whether it's someone you watch on your own, on YouTube or any other platform. You want pastors like this. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6. Paul says, I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. Verse 7. So then neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase. Now he that planteth and he that watereth are one, and every man shall receive his own reward according to his own labor. See how this all connects even back then? Everyone should receive his own reward according to his own labor. What you see in verses 6 through 8 of chapter 3 is a couple simple things. The role of the pastor is to plant and to water and leave the increase up to God. If you look at the role of a pastor, much like the farmer, that's a perfect illustration. Okay? The role of a pastor, he is to plant and to water and leave the increase up to God. The role of a pastor, wait, did I say pastor first or? Okay. The role of a farmer, right, is to plant, water, leave the increase up to God. The role of the pastor is to preach the word, water, right, and leave the increase, the number of people who attend, up to God. Okay? But they are to be ones who labor in the Word. I mentioned this before. It's sad when a church expects the pastor to grow the numbers and not God. Then your focus is on the wrong person. The role of the pastor is to make sure that they are planting and watering and allowing God to do the increase. Now let's go back to our text and let's finish this up. Continuing on, Paul writes, and he says, about holy things, live of the things of the temple. So, real quick, what Paul is saying here is that those who minister about holy things, live of the things of the temple. Paul there is bringing them back into the Hebrew Scriptures. Okay? He's bringing them back to the priestly system. Okay? And a couple things to point out first. The word holy things, the words holy things, is heros. Heros, meaning sacred, holy. By the way, the heros is where we get the word I can't say it now. Hieroglyphic. There we go. I couldn't look at you guys. I don't know. Why? Because hieroglyphics, I don't know why I can't say the word, were regarded as sacred writings by the Egyptians. So, there you go. The only other time hieros is used in the Greek Scriptures, listen to 2 Timothy 3:15. Because that's the only other time where it's found. It says, and that from a child thou hast known the Holy Scriptures. The hieros. The Holy Scriptures. And then he says, live of the things. Paul there is, of course, now referring back to the priests. Deuteronomy 18:1. Last week we talked about Deuteronomy chapter 25. This week, Deuteronomy 18:1. Deuteronomy 18:1, Moses writes that the priest and all of the tribe of Levi shall eat the offerings that are given unto the Lord by fire, okay, from the children of Israel. Why? Because in Deuteronomy 18:1, Moses says, the priests, the Levites, have no inheritance into the nation. God had said that they would be his inheritance, and he would provide for them. You see, the Levites, think about this, guys. The Levites, how did they live? They lived utterly dependent upon the free giving of the children of Israel. Okay? That was their sole dependency. Then Paul says here, of the temple. There are two Greek words translated as temple in the Greek Scriptures. Naos is the first one, which refers to the actual temple building and including the holy place and the Holy of Holies. Now, the Holy of Holies is the part of the temple where the high priest would go in every year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And he would go representing the nation of Israel and offering the sacrifice for the sins of the nation from the previous year to cover their sins. In the Holy of Holies, and I believe I give you guys the scriptures, that is where God dwelt. The presence of God was found there. And I think some of the scriptures I gave you as well. Yeah, exactly. The Shekinah glory of God. Some of the scriptures, the one in Ezekiel chapter 10 verse 18 describes the glory of the Lord departing from the Holy of Holies. Okay, so the Holy of Holies, naos. And then the other Greek word for temple that is found in the Greek Scriptures is hieron. Hieron, which means literally all of the temple complex, including the courts surrounding the temple. So not just the Holy of Holies, right? That was naos. Now you have the whole temple complex. What word did Paul use under the inspiration of God here? to refer to the temple, he used the hieron, referring to the whole temple. So what is Paul doing here? He's referring to every Levitical priest who served. And not just saying it was only, those offerings were only for the high priest who went into the Holy of Holies once a year. No, he says it was available to every priest, even the low priest whose job it was to make sure no Gentile went into the courts. The guy who might have been forgotten, he would receive of the fruits, if you will, of the offerings. Even he would be taken care of. And that's what Paul was tying in here, I think, under the inspiration of God, saying the Levites lived off of the offerings. The Levites lived from what was offered here. By the way, the word temple is hieron. I already said that, Doug. Now, hieron is the same word as holy things that we just had earlier. That's what I was trying to say. And then he says this, and they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar. So Paul is just continuing this whole aspect. Those that wait. By the way, the word of the Greek for those that wait is a word that we would say a waiter today. What is the role of a waiter in a restaurant? Is the role of the waiter to literally serve you in every way possible? No, because I don't think while you're eating dinner that a waiter would gladly give you a pedicure. Right? What is their role as a waiter? They're to go and serve your needs in regard to what? To that meal. And that was the idea there of the priest, is they were there waiting, ready to attend and to serve. And of course, this is referring to those who were in the temple. By the way, this is the only time in the Greek scriptures this word is used for those that wait. And then he speaks of at the altar, speaking of the temple altar that was used for sacrifices. And then he says, are partakers with. And this is a word that brings couples or brings things together. And basically it means that you take something and then you share it with others. So you divide it amongst others. And are partakers with. This is the only time that word is used in the Greek scriptures. And then he says the altar. So again, Paul is wrapping this all up by giving an illustration of the Levitical priesthood. Why would Paul, listen, if this was not a largely, let me start over. If the assembly in Corinth was predominantly Gentile, why would Paul continue to bring up Hebraic illustrations? You see? He's talking about those in the temple. Why? Because he knew his audience was largely Jewish. We've established that from the beginning. But this is, again, one of those little proofs for you and I to be able to stake and say, okay, he is revealing this to Jewish Christians. So, second time in 2 weeks, we see Paul using an illustration from the Hebrew Scriptures. I mentioned before. The other one, of course, was Deuteronomy chapter 25. And so, I think I gave you guys passages there where the Levitical priests lived off of the offerings of the people. And I gave you passages on there from the Hebrew Scriptures to prove that. We'll close quickly here in verse 14. Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. Paul here is making a strong statement, okay, that the Lord has ordained this. By the way, the word ordained here in the Greek is diatasso. Diatasso. Diatasso simply means to arrange in an orderly or organized fashion. So what is Paul saying there? Paul is saying that the Lord has set this up. We see the Lord first doing this for the apostles in Matthew 10:10 and Luke 10 verse 7, where when he sent the disciples out to minister, and he had arranged that they would be taken care of. And now, Paul says, us in this age of grace, we see that God takes care of those who labor in the word. Galatians 6:6 says, "Let him that is taught in the word communicate unto him that teacheth in all good things." 1 Timothy 5:17 and 18, Paul writes to young pastor Timothy, "Let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine." I love that passage. That is one passage that I try to make sure, guys, I keep myself accountable to. Because, like I said before, many churches do not require their pastors to labor in the word and doctrine. And so Paul here says, "Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live off of the gospel." What is Paul saying there? He's saying that those who labor in the preaching of the good news of the gospel should make their living from it if, listen, if the church can support that. I add that caveat. If the church can support it, then they should fully support the pastor. If the church cannot, then don't worry about it. Now, why are we talking about all of this? I mentioned for the last 3 weeks, I'm not here to ask for a raise. So what's the motivation? The motivation simply is, this is where we're at in our text. And it's good for us to know. Like I said, if something were to happen to me and you guys need to start finding a new pastor, you want to find someone who rightly divides, you want to find someone who's willing to work and labor in the gospel. That is who you want as your pastor. You don't want to choose the best looking. You don't want to choose the most eloquent. You want to choose the one who labors in word and doctrine. And that is the message here. The role of a pastor is one who works hard in the word and doctrine. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word.